Hey friends, welcome back. Again, I'm John Pflug. This is James Spurgeon, and today we're going through the book of 2 Kings in our study of the Old Testament books. We are all the way through 1 Kings, where we've heard about Solomon and the beginning of the prophetic ministry of Elijah, and now we're into the second part of that, which is appropriately named 2 Kings. So let's talk, since Elijah played a big role in the end of 1 Kings, we still see him a little bit here in the beginning of 2 Kings. How does Elijah's ministry ultimately end?
Well, Elijah, in chapter 2 of 2 Kings, it comes time where he realizes it's time for him to go, to be done. And so he tells Elisha, I'm going now, and Elisha says, I'm going with you, and Elijah says, no, you stay here. And Elisha says, no, I'm going. And so they go a little further, and Elijah says to him, no, I want you to stay here. And Elisha has this request of Elijah about, if it's possible, give me a double portion of your spirit. And Elijah says to him, if you're here when I depart, then you'll receive that double portion of my spirit. And so, as they go further along, all of a sudden there is a chariot of fire and horses, and Elijah is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. And Elisha witnesses it, and then thus, I guess, formally begins the ministry or the career of Elisha.
Yes. And it's a really cool story. I think it's a memorable one. Even some people who maybe haven't read the Old Testament in a long time might remember. That might be a standout story where he's taken up in the whirlwind.
Right.
And he's only one of, I think, 2 people in the Bible that are taken up without dying. The other one being Enoch. Right.
And so we've all heard, swing low, sweet chariot,
swing low,
coming forward to carry me home. That's from the 2 Kings chapter 2.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as you mentioned, Elijah's successor is Elisha. Very similar names. One's with a J and one's with an S. So Elijah gets taken up into heaven in a whirlwind, the chariots of fire. Elisha then becomes the prophet there, the prominent prophet in Israel. And he really is truly a prophet in his own right. He does a lot of interesting things. Tell us about some of the things that Elisha does in his ministry.
You know, the first or the next 6 or 8 chapters after Elijah is taken into heaven, read as a chronicle of, not necessarily a chronicle, just almost a highlight reel of the things that happened in Elisha's ministry. And Elisha comes across as he's sort of, even though there's a king in Israel, in Samaria, and Elisha's ministry centers in Samaria, even though there's a king there, Elisha comes across as the real ruler. And the kings actually go to him to get information and to find out what's going on. Foreign kings come to see him. And it's almost as if, yeah, there's a king in Samaria, but if you want to know who's really in charge, it's Elisha.
He's the superstar, man.
And it's interesting, he asks Elijah for a double portion of his spirit before Elijah goes up into heaven. And then if you chronicle the miracles that are done by the hands of Elijah compared to those by Elisha, there are twice as many miracles. And so it's just interesting how that works out.
I didn't know that. That's an interesting piece of information, that he asked for a double share, and indeed a double the miracles were done by Elisha.
You know, Elijah goes and he's commanded in 1 Kings to go be sustained by the widow and her son. And it's said that the cruse of oil shall not run low and the barrels shall not be empty until the famine is over. And so miraculously every day there's just enough there each day for them to survive by. And then the widow's son dies and Elijah raises him to life. Elisha does the same thing. Elisha has an instance where he tells the widow to put out all these bowls, and they're miraculously filled with oil so that she'll have enough oil. And she has a promised child that she loses. He dies, and then she calls for Elisha, and Elisha comes and raises him back from the dead. Also, there's I don't know if you've ever heard of this term before, but some churches have what they call a prophet's chamber. Attached to the church, it's just a place where a visiting minister might stay while he's there. And that comes from 2 Kings also, from Elisha's ministry, where the Shunammite woman builds an addition to her house so that when Elisha is coming through, he can stay there, and he takes advantage. He does stay there. Because of her hospitality, he says, yes, I'll do that. And then she is blessed. Her house is blessed because he's there. He makes an axe head float. There's a pot of poisonous stew that I don't know if the proper word is he tames it. He makes it okay again. There are different miracles that are attributed to him.
Okay. 2 Kings is important for us historically because, well, probably the most significant historical event in the nation of Israel, the history of them as a nation, occurs in 2 Kings. What is it that's so significant that occurs in 2 Kings? Tell us about it.
Well, in chapter 16, you have the fall of Samaria. Remember, in 1 Kings, the kingdom is divided between the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. And the capital, of course, of the southern tribes is Jerusalem, where the sons of David continue to reign, and the dynasty of David continues. But the northern kingdom goes through 4 different dynasties of kings, because one will commit evil against the Lord, and the Lord will say, I've had enough of you, I'm going to end your dynasty and set up this other guy. And of course he does evil, and they go through the same thing again. And the capital of the northern kingdom becomes Samaria. And the Bible records that the Assyrian Empire comes down in chapter 16 and wipes out Samaria and carries all the people away captive. And it's a terrible story because it begins listing, and this happened because of this sin, and this sin, and this sin. It's just a chronicle of all the sins that they had committed. And it's just, if you have a heart in you, when you read it, you're just saddened by it. That they rebelled and rebelled and rebelled and rebelled until God said enough. Mm-hmm. And they're carried away captive. These are the lost tribes of Israel. They're carried away captive, never to be heard from again.
And so that effectively ended the
kingdom.
northern nation of Israel.
Yes.
Yeah.
It met its demise by being conquered by the Assyrians. In fact, the Assyrians were doing something that was unheard of up until them. In the ancient world, when they conquered a place, they didn't just subjugate the people who were there. They carried them off somewhere else. And they replaced them with other people. And it was their way of ensuring that this territory that they had conquered would not rebel against them in the future. And so it was really a brutal, brutal way to end the northern kingdom. But that's what Assyria did. And God brought them down as his hand of judgment.
And what happens in the south then after the north is taken away?
Well, Sennacherib, who's the king of Assyria, actually sends his armies to besiege Jerusalem, and Hezekiah is the king of Jerusalem at the time. And he takes the words of Sennacherib and he lays out the promises of God, and he prays to God and says, will you save us from this? And God does. God answers his prayer. And the boastful, the Rabshakeh which is the commander, I suppose, the general of the Assyrian army, he hears a rumor and he's gone, and they're spared.
So the southern kingdom gets to continue to survive at least for a little while longer.
For a little while longer, until the end of 2 Kings is the end of the southern kingdom also. They're conquered by Nebuchadnezzar for their rebellion, and
that's the Babylonians, right? Nebuchadnezzar's leading the Babylonians to destroy ultimately Jerusalem and Judah.
Yes.
Okay. It sounds like there are a lot of pitiful kings. I mean, a lot of wicked, bad kings in Israel that lead ultimately up to the destruction of both the northern and the southern kingdom. Would you say that's true?
Yes.
Who's the most wicked among them?
Well, in the northern kingdom, you got to go with Ahab, with the caveat that I'm going to throw out Jeroboam the first one. also, and I'll explain that in a minute. But Ahab just totally, he brings in Baal worship. He, because of Jezebel, his wife, she hunts down the prophets of the Lord and kills them. And Ahab, the Bible actually says in 1 Kings that Ahab is just sinned more wickedly than any who had come before him. And so I'd probably go with Ahab, although, interestingly enough, there is not a good king of Israel, the northern kingdom. There never was. And it kind of takes you back to Jeroboam. Yeah. Jeroboam, over and over again, it repeats this phrase as you go through 1st and 2nd Kings, that even though this particular king might have done some things right, nevertheless, he stumbled over the stumbling block that was set up by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, by which he caused Israel to stumble, which is simply that Jeroboam set up idolatry in the northern kingdom to keep the people from going to worship in Jerusalem. And so none of the kings ever got rid of that. And so even though they may have done some things right, ultimately they were evil kings because they refused to do away with the idolatry in the northern kingdom.
What about in the southern kingdom? Were there any were there bad kings there too?
Yes, it's off and on in the southern kingdom. There's a bad king and a good king and a bad king and maybe a couple good kings and maybe a couple bad kings, and then you come across Manasseh. Manasseh's the son of Hezekiah, and Manasseh is so evil that he destroys the worship of Yahweh completely, and he brings in the worship of Moloch, which is a Canaanite god. They would offer up their firstborn sons as burnt offerings to Moloch, and Manasseh actually caused his son to pass through the fire as an offering to Moloch. And he was he sinned, according to 2 Kings, worse than any king who had come before him.
Isn't there also an extra biblical story about that king who Manasseh, who executes Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, right?
Yes, according to Jewish tradition, Isaiah meets his demise at the beginning of the reign of Manasseh. That would put Isaiah, if we count up in Isaiah chapter 1, we'll get into this more when we get into the book of Isaiah. That would stretch him out just a little over 100 years. But according to Jewish tradition, yes, that he lives to the end of Hezekiah's reign, and then he is sawn in half
by Manasseh.
And there may be a reference to that in Hebrews chapter 11, by the way.
Okay.
Where it says some were sawn asunder.
Yeah, and we do, but in Kings, in 2 Kings, we actually do get a cameo from Isaiah, though, don't we? He does appear in the reign of Hezekiah.
Yes, in fact, there are 3 chapters in 2 Kings that are repeated almost word for word in the book of Isaiah. And so Isaiah is the prophet in Jerusalem during the reign of Uzziah, and I won't get all the kings right. Ahaz and Hezekiah, and I think there's another one in there.
Well, James, you've pointed out that we've got some pretty wicked kings in the south, and we've got some really wicked kings in the north. Were there any good ones?
There were a few. You go through a few pretty good kings. And even the pretty good kings in the southern kingdom, the sons of David, have their flaws. For example, I would get into Uzziah's flaw, but that's more brought out in Chronicles. We'll save that. But you get into Hezekiah. Hezekiah was a good king. And even though Hezekiah was a good king, you still see his flaws, because he is the one ultimately who invites the ambassadors from Babylon in and shows them all the wealth. And God says, I want you to know that it's a boastful thing that he does. Look at what I have. And God says, because you have done this, all this wealth will be carried away into Babylon in the future. So Hezekiah's a good king. Josiah's a good king. Josiah comes